Hello and welcome back to the Classics Capsule with me, Sean McKiernan. And today, it's a very strange topic today in a way. It's not so much one film or one particular series of films I'm going to be looking at. It's more of an entire genre which began life very much as a genre and it finished up as a movement in its own right, and which ended up affecting an awful lot of policy decisions in the country that the films originated from. The early 1970s were not a very happy time anywhere in the white world really for anybody of coloured skin. Race relations were not very good, they weren't very well received with anybody at all. And a series of films began, very much as an ethnic subgenre of the exploitation films of black people. But they were an exact mirror image of the usual exploitation films where the black people were seen very much as heroes. And even it just very small little victories, but they were portrayed as overcoming all kinds of obstacles, sometimes very much symbolic symbols of the white domination. It all emerged around the early 1970s, and they rank among the very first that the black characters are the heroes. Up until then they'd always been sort of very much background characters or pretty much constantly the villains of the piece, and generally not very well written and not very well portrayed either, in all honesty. They generally chose quite poor actors to do them, usually so that white actors would shine out even more. As the films developed, it coincided with a massive rethinking and repositioning of race relations, not only in America but all around the world. They were originally intended as a vehicle and for films primarily for the African American convicted population. They were never really intended to appeal beyond that. However, the audience appeal broadened to the point where it was going right across all the ethnic and the racial divides, and you were getting more and more white people wanting to watch these films, which meant Hollywood started to take an interest, and the whole thing then exploded in quite a massive way. And at this particular point, the genre was given a name, which came about from the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. The head of that, a gentleman named Julius Griffin, coined the phrase Blaxploitation. And from that point on, the genre was universally known as Blaxploitation films. The National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People then began to promote these films and support these films, and they did an absolutely wonderful job of doing so, and they achieved a massive following all around the world. Very different from a lot of films of the time, most of which all featured very grand, very cinematic and orchestral music scores. Blaxploitation films used pop music, usually funk and soul music, and were actually the very first films to do that. That of course then bled into non-blaxploitation films as well, which then began to affect right across the entire genre, and that was something that really only stopped with the onset of films like Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Star Wars, which immediately went back to using orchestras, and then the two sort of coexisted side by side quite happily. The blaxploitation films, the early ones in particular, they can really be split pretty much down the middle, depending on where they're set, depended on what they were really about. If they're set in the north, or the east or the west coast of America, they generally be set in very poor urban neighbourhoods, and would very much be about struggles of black people, usually centering on one particular hero or one particular family, and the battles that they would have to basically just try to improve their lives and the way they had to live their lives because of the way they'd be treated at that particular point in time. If they'd be set in the South, then they would be centred more on the black slaves and on the issues that they faced, the brutality of that particular time, and the fact that whatever they did was wrong. And there was a lot of tension, and there was one film in particular which I'll be touching on and discussing in a little more detail in a little while, which really does concentrate on that. And it's a wonderful, wonderful film as well, but it doesn't hold any punches. It basically shows things as they actually were. No matter where they are set, they all agree on one thing, and that is that they generally do portray at least one black protagonist who overcomes enormous odds created by the whites and usually overcomes some sort of emblem of white supremacy. Might be because the villain of the piece is white and gets the comeuppance at the end thanks to a black person. There are an awful lot of subtypes come off from the films, from the actual blaxploitation genre itself, and you get some horror films, the likes of, believe it or not, Blackula, which I will be looking at in a little while, but really the least said about it the better. It has got to be seen to be believed. The title of it doesn't really help it really, but you get crime films such as Foxy Lady, there are action films,
Foxy Brown,
and thank you, Voice of the Gods, and you get some wonderful comedy films such as Uptown Saturday Night. Now, as well as all of that as well, it was also very, very good at parodying itself, and not only parodying itself, it also was parodied by other filmmakers, one very famous one in particular, which will be touched on very briefly in this, before his films are looked at in a little more detail in the next edition of the Classics Capsule, but we'll come to that later. The blaxploitation films even got as far as James Bond, which in 1972, when Live and Let Die was being put together, Cubby Broccoli, always one with an eye for what is going to make a profit, realised that the blaxploitation films and the blaxploitation movement was gathering real pace and was making money, and so it was decided that Live and Let Die would be the next film because here was an opportunity to cast a lot of black actors. The downside of Live and Let Die is that 99% of the black actors are very stereotypical characters. They're very sort of Harlem speak the whole way through it, and the characters aren't really that original in that film, but again, that's something that we'll look at. The films are generally very, very violent. They don't hold back on anything, be it the racial tensions, the sexual tensions both between the black people and between the blacks and the whites, and in terms of violence. There were a lot of violent uprisings, there were a lot of extremely violent put-downs of the uprisings, and the better films don't shirk away from it. Now, the absolute irony of the whole blaxploitation movement, it really did gather pace right the way through the 70s. And towards the end of the 1970s, the overall movement came to a shudder and halt when the exact organisation which had promoted it and supported it at the beginning and throughout the decade joined forces with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the National Urban League. And they formed a thing which they called the Coalition Against Blaxploitation, which ultimately led to the genre's demise as an actual filmmaking group. However, it wasn't the end for the Blaxploitation films at all. As we see nowadays, we are getting more and more versions of Shaft, which is generally regarded as the very first of the important Blaxploitation films for the very simple reason that it was written by Ernest Tidyman and John D.F. Blackthorne. And it's from Tidyman's own novel. Tidyman then went away and wrote the screenplay for it, and directed by Gordon Parks. And in the novel, Shaft is a white character. He's actually described in all of the blurb for the book as being hotter than Bond and cooler than Bullet. However, it was decided through the audition process that they came across a black actor named Richard Roundtree, who up at that point he hadn't really done that many features at all. He was generally known for making commercials. It was decided there and then to make John Shaft black. It was never an intention to make any statement of any kind. The only intention at that point was to just make a fun film that anybody could enjoy going out to watch on a Saturday night. That is what the director wanted to do. It became much more important than that, for the simple reason that here was a black character basically doing everything that up until that point only white characters had been seen doing, and it was a huge success. It spawned a television series. Not a very long-lived television series, admittedly, but there was a television series in America based on the film.
2 sequels.
And also 2 subsequent sequels. In the late 1990s, the entire Shaft franchise was resurrected when the mighty Samuel L. Jackson took a major interest in the thing and played a new version of Shaft as the nephew of the original John Shaft. And those films see a return of the original John Shaft, still played by Richard Roundtree, and who regards the film as not only his major breakthrough, which he's very, very proud of, but he does consider it to be not only a breakthrough film for him, but a breakthrough film for black actors in general, because they were suddenly being considered for major roles and major lead roles in films that they would generally not be considered for. Even if they didn't actually get the parts, the fact is they were now being considered for them. That then follows on to the films like, I've already mentioned this and I've got to mention it again, Blackula, where you get an actor, a massively underrated actor named William Marshall, who was an absolute tower of a man. He was nearly 6 feet 6 inches tall. He had one of the greatest voices you could imagine. He was a brilliant actor, but he never ever got the recognition that his performances deserved. He plays an African prince who goes to Castle Dracula to try to get Count Dracula to join in the uprising against the slave movement, and Dracula not only refuses to do it, but also bites the African prince and turns him into a vampire. Now, rather than give the film an original name, they decided to play on the fact that, hey, we're going to have a black vampire here, so let's call it Blackula. it's just dreadful from start to finish. There's no other way you can describe it. It is saved to a degree by Marshall's performance, but it is one of the films you've got to watch it just for the experience. It's another one like Plan 9 from Outer Space, which is another one. It's so bad, it's outstandingly good just because of how awful it is.
And the sequel, Scream, Blackula.
There is also a sequel which somehow or other they managed to resurrect Blackula, even though at the end of Blackula he walks up the top of a tower block into the morning sun and disintegrates. But somehow or other, as per with all of the Dracula films, and no matter what happens to Christopher Lee at the end of the Dracula films, he's always back again, completely reanimated, the whole lot. Oh, to be a vampire. Again in 1972, there was a crime film came out called Across 110th Street, which is a very interesting take on the crime film genre in that it pairs two characters as per always, but it's not a buddy movie. It stars Anthony Quinn and a quite wonderful actor named Yaphet Kotto, and they are given the job of finding a group of robbers who stole $300,000 from the mafia, and they have to find the robbers before the mafia find the robbers. The twist on it is that Anthony Quinn is incredibly racist and incredibly anti-working with a black partner, but he's also on the take with the mob. Now, up until this point, you would have expected it to be the other way around and for it to be the black policeman to be like that, but this film, it switches that around, and it's quite an interesting take and a very interesting play on that sort of relationship. It is a bit of a gore fest, Across 110th Street. It's not an easy film to watch, but it is, with that said, it is very, very entertaining just for the two central performances. Anthony Quinn and Yaphet Kotto do spark off each other very, very well. And even though it is a very, very serious film, you do get the impression that the two of them are enjoying working with each other massively. Yaphet Kotto, of course, went on to enormous global fame straight from that film when, thanks to the persistence of United Artists, who were involved in making 110th Street, they suggested to Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman that he should be considered for the principal villain role in Live and Let Die. Broccoli was not that keen on the idea until he met Yaphet Kotto, and he actually voiced his concerns to the actor about making a film like Live and Let Die and portraying all of the villains were all black, which is as they are in the Fleming novel. It wasn't something that Fleming was making up just for the film. And Ian Fleming and Harry Saltzman were both a little bit concerned about how the film was going to be perceived because it wasn't showing black people in a particularly good light. And Yaphet Kotto's response was to reassure him to the point where, as he said, the way the black actors are looking at it, we're getting the opportunity to work on a film that's going to be a global smash just because it's carrying the name James Bond. And yes, it's going to be a risk because it's launching a whole new James Bond, but so what? It's still going to be James Bond, and that automatically means it's going to be a success. And look at all the black actors who are going to actually get some exposure as a result of it. Yaphet Kotto gives quite a startling performance as Mr. Kananga and Mr. Big. But as I said earlier, Live and Let Die is really let down by the portrayal of some of the lesser characters and some of the dialogue where James Bond is, when he's being trailed by a black CIA agent, and he says it's like following a cue ball through Harlem. Doesn't really help the film. It does age it quite badly. But Yaphet Kotto, of course, very nearly went on to even greater fame and fortune when he was some 12 years later, after Live and Let Die, when he was actually on the shortlist to be the captain of the Starship Enterprise as Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek The Next Generation. He was second on the list after Patrick Stewart, and was actually Gene Roddenberry's preferred choice for the role until he was persuaded otherwise by the television executives that Patrick Stewart would be the better option. But Yaphet Kotto was very, very nearly the captain of the Starship Enterprise. Moving on into 1973, again another allegedly horror film, which again has got to be seen to be believed because it is so awful. And again, which also plays on the fact that it's very much black-centred, it is intended really as a parody of Frankenstein. And it is called, believe it or not, Blackenstein. And the monster is black. You get the likes of Coffee, which does sort of give a bit of extra life into the Blaxploitation films. Came out round about the same time as Blackenstein, where Pam Grier, in her biggest hit of her career really, plays a nurse who turns vigilante and goes after a gang of drug dealers who've got a daughter hooked on heroin. It is a very, very good film, but the only downside of it is it was subsequently then remade once or twice, again with Pam Grier, basically playing exactly the same character, doing exactly the same thing in films like Foxy Lady.
Foxy Brown.
Or Foxy Brown. It would have been much. There's nothing wrong with casting Pam Grier in the same film, but give us something different to do. Write a different film. Don't keep going back to tell the same story over and over again. And really, it did really sort of run out of steam, and
we didn't care.
They tried a number of things by sort of injecting elements from different films like Bond and martial arts films, and they actually tried to mix the two of them and came up with a film called That Man Bolt, starring Fred Williamson. Mm-hmm. It was the first spy film in the Blaxploitation era, and it was the first real black movies that had a black spy. It had been done on television in America before, of course, with I Spy with Bill Cosby, which anytime I watch I Spy, I'm not entirely certain if you're supposed to take it seriously or not, because sometimes you think, yes, this is supposed to be a serious drama, and other times you think it's very much tongue-in-cheek, along the sort of same lines as The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was. Whatever talents Bill Cosby may have had, he, being a dramatic actor, wasn't really one of them. He may well have been a very good comedian and a very good comedy actor, but anytime he tried to do drama, it sort of weighed a little bit heavy. It's just something that he didn't seem able to do. Now, in 1974, a film came out by a film producer who, even by that point, had developed a reputation for producing very, very funny parodies of films, sometimes centering on one particular theme or one particular genre, sometimes taking an almighty scattergun approach and hitting God knows how many targets in the process. And in 1974, Mel Brooks, for he is the filmmaker, brought out Blazing Saddles, which aims a gun very squarely at the head of the Hollywood racism, but in doing so takes quite an unfair aim really at the Blaxploitation films and the Blaxploitation movement. the film is absolutely hysterically funny. It's not just a parody of Blaxploitation. It takes elements from the Blaxploitation films and pokes fun at them. I think it's actually mainly supposed to be a parody of westerns, but because it has quite a lot of Blaxploitation elements in it, it has to be considered as a bit of a parody of the Blaxploitations. The following year, 1975, Dino De Laurentiis produced an absolute classic film. Even today, it is so powerful. And that film is called Mandingo. It is a story of the plantation slaves and the plantation slavery, and it is unbelievably brutal, but it shows what life was like on the plantation for the slaves and the way they were treated. And you can only imagine, looking back, the impact that film must have had and the controversy that it must have caused. But you watch it today and it is so powerful, it is unbelievable. And it's one of the films, if you've never seen it, you should go and watch it. You should seek it out and watch it. It is absolutely it is a brilliant film, superbly shot, the whole lot. Again, one of the most important films in the entire Blaxploitation genre and the Blaxploitation movement. The same year, there was another parody came out of the Blaxploitation films by the name of Coonskin, which it's actually a very clever film, and it mixes live action with animation, but it is very much a parody. It tells the story of an African American rabbit who teams up with a fox and a bear, and they rise to the top of an organised crime syndicate. Even thinking about the film does make me laugh. It is very, very funny, but it is a little bit. It's a bit cruel about how it pokes fun at films which are very, very well meaning. And see, the 70s was really the decade of the Blaxploitation films. By the end of the 70s, they were running out of steam. And the coalition against Blaxploitation campaigned actively against the films and succeeded on the most part in getting them stopped in the productions. And throughout the 80s, an awful lot of the time, there weren't that many black characters appearing. You get the odds one or two. Billy D. Williams, for example, makes an appearance in The Empire Strikes Back. Again, fairly stereotypical of a black character in it. He turns out to be a little bit of a rogue, and not a very pleasant rogue, in betraying people who are supposed to be his friends. But of course he is ultimately redeemed in Return of the Jedi when he suddenly turns into one of the good guys and gets to blow up the Death Star. So, but when we get to the end of the 1990s, we started to see a whole new generation of filmmakers, the two most famous of the lot really being Spike Lee and John Singleton, who take a lot of elements of the Blaxploitation films into their own films that they make, both good and bad, but they're also pretty unflinching in the critical appraisal of the Blaxploitation films in their own movies, particularly Singleton in one film in particular, namely Boys in the Hood. There is some serious implicit criticism of the glorification, really, of the stereotypical behaviour of blacks. It is very stereotypical. It's a very, very difficult subject, Blaxploitation, and it goes in so many different directions. It's actually been very difficult to put this together and keep it condensed to a half-hour time slot. I could have gone on for something like about 3 hours about this. An honorary mention really has to be made for a British television situation comedy of the time, which actually cannot be shown or repeated in any way, shape or form anymore, named Love Thy Neighbour, which featured as its 4 main characters. There were 2 families, one white, one black. The white husband, very, very down-to-earth, working class, union orientated, labour supporting and incredibly racist. And his new next door neighbours are from the Caribbean. They are black, and the man of the house is a Conservative supporter. So you've got immediate conflict there. But of course, because they are black, it rises the racial tensions from the white character. Added to the fact that the 2 wives get on like a house on fire. And the major criticism of the series is ridiculous, because it always says that it glorifies the racial approach towards black people, when the whole point of the comedy was to point out that black people can be just as racist as white people can. And at the start of every single episode, the black character who ends up getting a job in the exact same factory as the white character as the shop steward, so ends up having to deal with the white character who is the union representative on a daily basis. Each morning as they're going out to work, they will greet each other with, "Good morning, Sambo, good morning, Snowflake." That all gets forgotten about, because apparently it's only the white character that was racist. Now, this just sums up how ridiculous it is. You'll never see the series repeated, but it is available on YouTube. The whole series is available on YouTube. You can get it on DVD, and it's all completely uncensored, completely uncut, but there's no television station will rebroadcast it. It just goes to show how sensitive in nature that race relations still are, and how careful companies on television tend to be. And it's a great shame really that there isn't another movement like the Blaxploitation, which was really, really daring in what it did, because it basically just turned around and stuck 2 fingers up to the establishment. That was how it started. And it just said, we are going to make films for black people. And maybe it was a surprise, maybe it shouldn't have been classed as a surprise. But as these films were being made, white people enjoyed them just as much. And if nothing else, that shows that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the colour of your skin is. We're all people, and we all enjoy more or less the same things. Until the next edition of the Classics Capsule, this is Sean McKeon signing off. Thanks very much.